Welcome back to Night Train to Mondo Cine. I'm your host, Dave Wilt. This is the second episode on Carlos Villarías, the Spanish Dracula. In the first episode, we looked at his early life, his emigration to the United States, and his singing career up through 1929. This episode will cover the Spanish language films that he made in Hollywood, including his most famous film role in the 1931 Dracula. Carlos Villarías actually had three film careers in the 1930s. He appeared in Spanish-language Hollywood productions, in English-language Hollywood productions, and in Mexican cinema. Rather than look at this period of his life in a strictly chronological manner, we'll deal with each of these categories in separate episodes. When we last saw Carlos Villarías, he had just completed a long run in the West Coast stage version of The Desert Song, concluding in the summer of 1929. Beginning in 1930, Villarías would become one of the most prolific performers in a new cinematic phenomenon, Hollywood Spanish-language talking pictures. A number of Spanish-language shorts had been produced in the USA during the 1920s, and René Cardona, later a major figure in the Mexican film industry, produced and appeared in an independent feature, Sombras Habaneras, made at the Tech Art Studios in Hollywood in September 1929. The following month, Sono Art produced Sombras de Gloria, a Spanish-language version of Blaze o' Glory. The star was Jose Boer, who'd have a long career in the USA, Mexico, and Chile. Sono Art would repeat this pattern early in 1930, with Así es la vida, also starring Boer, shot simultaneously with the English-language version What a Man. Hal Roach was shooting foreign-language versions of shorts starring Laurel and Hardy, Our Gang, Charlie Chase, and so on. Other independent features also went into production in early 1930, some of them in Spanish language only. However, the first major Hollywood studio to initiate a program of multiple language versions was Paramount, and Carlos Villarías was there when it happened. El Cuerpo del Delito, or The Body of the Crime, was shot in March 1930 at the same time as The Benson Murder Case, starring William Powell as Detective Philo Vance. The Spanish-language version featured Ramon Pereda in this role, with Antonio Moreno, a bona fide Hollywood star of the 1920s, top billed as a red herring, a part played by Paul Lucas in the English version. Carlos Villarías was cast as District Attorney John F.X. Markham, played by E.H. Calvert in the original. How did Villarías get this part, considering he'd never had a significant role in a Hollywood film before? With the exception of Moreno, Barry Norton, and Vicente Padula, a Mexican and two Argentines, the cast of El Cuerpo del Delito was made up primarily of Spanish actors resident in Hollywood, and since Carlos Villarías was a member of this fairly small community, he'd probably have been known to his fellow performers. Additionally, Andres de Segurola, who plays the murder victim, was, like Villarías, a Spanish opera singer who also had a film career, so it's possible Villarías had an additional booster there. Carlos Villarías received generally good reviews for his performance in El Cuerpo del Delito. In the April 30th, 1930 issue of the Los Angeles newspaper La Opinión, Gabriel Navarro wrote, "The acting honors belong to Ramon Pereira, Andrés de Segurola, Carlos Villarías, and Maria Calvo. Regarding Señor Villarías, he seems to us notable, perfectly natural in his acting." El Cuerpo del Delito opened at the Teatro California in Los Angeles at the end of August 1930. Unfortunately, as with most of Hollywood's dual-language films made in this era, El Cuerpo del Delito is not readily available for viewing today. However, the second sound film featuring Carlos Villarías is one of those that is still extant. Estrellados went into production in March 1930 at the MGM Studios, filmed in English as Free and Easy. Estrellados is interesting formally, since it features newly shot scenes with the Spanish-speaking cast, as well as footage from the English-language original, some of it dubbed into Spanish. Unlike El Cuerpo del Delito, this project retained star Buster Keaton in both versions. Carlos Villarías appears in only one scene, as the Master of Ceremonies at a film premiere. His character is named Jack Collier, a reference to William Collier Sr., who had the role in the English-language version. Villarías himself worked frequently as a Master of Ceremonies in California during the 1930s to supplement his screen work, and he's fine in this small part, bantering with Keaton, whose Spanish is awkward to say the least. Over the next 6 months, Carlos Villarías worked constantly on the new wave of Spanish-language features being produced by Hollywood studios. In April 1930, he appeared in Fox's El Precio de un Beso, the Spanish version of One Mad Kiss. Unlike most other dual-language projects, in this case, most of the main players, stars Jose Mojica, Mona Maris, Antonio Moreno, and Tom Patricola, worked in both versions. It's unclear if Carlos Villarías only appeared in El Precio de un Beso or if he worked in One Mad Kiss as well. Villarías was once more teamed with a fellow opera singer, the Mexican Jose Mojica. They would work together several more times in the near future. Paramount's Amor Audaz was another atypical Spanish-language production, shot at the same time as the English-language picture Slightly Scarlet. However, rather than retaining star Clive Brook or replacing him with a Spanish-speaking actor, Paramount chose to put Adolphe Menjou in the leading role. Menjou also starred in the French version made at the same time. He was born in Pittsburgh, but his father was French, so it's possible he had a good command of that language, but the response to Menjou's Spanish dialogue in Amor Audaz was not universally favorable. Carlos Villarías had a supporting role as a police inspector, replacing Georges Renavent from the English version. In May 1930, Villarías worked on El Hombre Malo, shot at the Warner Brothers Studios. This was the Spanish version of The Bad Man, replacing Walter Houston with Antonio Moreno. Some of the character names were changed in the Spanish version, so while Carlos Villarías plays Dobbs, there's no such named character in the original, so it's not known who played the equivalent role. Between July and October 1930, Carlos Villarías then made 4 straight features for Fox. Del Mismo Barro was the Spanish version of Common Clay, an adaptation of a 1913 play. The English-language film starred Lou Ayres and Constance Bennett, replaced by Juan Torrena and Mona Maris. Carlos Villarías played Judge Filson, a substantial supporting role taken in the original by Hale Hamilton. Carlos Villarías had only a small role in the western El Último de los Vargas, the Spanish version of The Last of the Duanes, based on a Zane Grey novel. George O'Brien's role was played in the Spanish version by George J. Lewis. El Valiente began filming in August as a three-reel film, but was expanded to feature-length with additional footage shot in September. Unlike a number of other dual-version films, El Valiente was not made at the same time as the original. The Valiant, starring Paul Muni, had been shot in 1929, so El Valiente was technically a remake. Juan Torrena starred in the Muni role as a man who admits he committed a murder but won't reveal why. Carlos Villarías was billed third in the significant part of the prison warden, originally played by DeWitt Jennings. The final Fox film made by Carlos Villarías prior to his role in Dracula was Cuando el Amor Ríe, shot in September 1930. This was another remake rather than a dual version. The original was The Love Gambler, a 1922 Western starring John Gilbert. Villarías was teamed again with singer Jose Mojica. Also in the cast were Mona Maris and Rene Cardona. The film was set in California when it was still controlled by Mexico. Villarías played the father of a young woman courted by the roguish Mojica and Cardona. Cuando el Amor Ríe was also released as Ladrón de Amor. On the 10th of October 1930, Carlos Villarías began work on what would become his signature role in Universal's Spanish-language version of Dracula. The Spanish version was filmed at night after the English-language crew had wrapped for the day. Exactly how Villarías got the role is unknown. In Hollywood Gothic, the book which reintroduced the Spanish version to the world, author David J. Scull just writes, Kohner and Melford selected a 38-year-old stage actor from Cordoba, Carlos Villarías Llano. But why? Was there an open casting call? Villarías was not exactly a stage actor, having worked mostly in musical theater, and even then his most recent significant stage work had concluded in the summer of 1929. He had, as we've just seen, made 9 films in the previous 9 months, and 7 of these had already been released, which means he was not exactly unknown in Hollywood. The roster of Hollywood's Spanish-speaking actors was relatively small, and the role of Dracula was not suited to everyone. It's conceivable an actor like Antonio Moreno could have played Count Dracula, and in fact, he had appeared as the hero of Universal's La Voluntad del Muerto, the Spanish-language version of The Cat Creeps, co-starring Lupita Tovar and directed by George Melford in the summer of 1930. It's possible Moreno didn't want to play the villain, or perhaps he wasn't even considered for the role of Dracula. Variety stated actor Soriano Viazco had been booked for the lead in the Spanish Dracula, but this was incorrect. Jose Soriano Viosca did appear in Dracula, but as Dr. Seward. In any case, Villarías was cast along with Mexicans Lupita Tovar and Eduardo Arozamena, Argentine Barry Norton, and fellow Spaniard Pablo Alvarez Rubio, who steals the film as the manic Renfield. Villarías was billed as Carlos Villar on Dracula. As we've seen, Villarías had used Charles Villar and Carlos Villar since the early 1920s, especially for his English-language work. Some of his Spanish-language credits were also under the Villar name. Curiously, the Dracula promotional materials virtually all credit him correctly as Carlos Villarías, even those which use Bela Lugosi's image. Much has been written comparing the English-language Dracula with the Spanish version, as well as Lugosi's performance versus that of Villarías. Villarías was costumed and made up to look like Lugosi, and reportedly had access to the dailies so he could pattern his performance on Lugosi's work. Aside from a few unfortunate grimaces meant to be horrible, Villarías does a fine job. He lacks Lugosi's charisma, but this is subjective. Viewers today can't necessarily separate Lugosi's persona based on his entire career from what we see in Dracula. while Villarías is inevitably compared to Lugosi's iconic performance, which is a bit unfair to him. When Dracula premiered at the Teatro California on the 9th of May 1931, Carlos Villarías and Lupita Tovar were in attendance, and Villarías introduced Bela Lugosi on stage between the first and second showings. Lugosi's version of Dracula was playing a few blocks away at the same time at the Fox Palace Cinema. Carlos Villarías was applauded for his role in Dracula, and as late as 1943 was being referred to as Carlos Dracula Villarías and Carlos Villarías el Dracula de la Raza in announcements for personal appearances. When Villarías made his first visit to Mexico in 1935, he appeared on stage at the Teatro Arbello in Mexico City in the stage version of Dracula for several months, with Alberto Martí taking the role subsequently. What would have been his final opportunity to play Count Dracula failed to materialize. In the mid-1940s, magician-actor David T. Bamberg, otherwise known as Fu Manchu, wanted to feature Villarías as the vampire and Bela Lugosi as the Frankenstein monster in an all-star horror comedy that unfortunately was never produced. Dracula premiered in the Cine Avenida in Madrid, Spain in March 1931, went on to play throughout Central and South America, and was periodically revived in Spanish-language cinemas in the USA, playing the Teatro Rex in Phoenix, Arizona in March and October 1936, for example. Despite the reported success of La Voluntad del Muerto and Dracula, virtually no other Spanish-language horror movies were made in Hollywood. In part, this can be attributed to the sudden decline in Spanish-language films in the latter half of 1931. The Universal-inspired horror boom had not really gotten underway. After Dracula, shot in the fall of 1930, the next Universal horror movie was Frankenstein, which went into production in August 1931, as did MGM's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When the production of Spanish-language films resumed in Hollywood later in 1932 and 1933, producers concentrated largely on comedies, musicals, and dramas, and a significant number of these films were originals, or at least not dual versions of current Hollywood productions. Dracula was shot from the 10th of October to the 8th of November 1930. Carlos Villarías took no time off, working on La Gran Jornada for Fox in November and December, and finishing 1930 with a major role in El Código Penal at Columbia. La Gran Jornada was the Spanish version of Fox's attempt at a Western epic, The Big Trail. French, Italian, and German alternate versions were also shot. George J. Lewis, who'd taken George O'Brien's role in El Último de los Vargas, steps in for John Wayne this time. Carlos Villarías was cast as Orena, a character name which doesn't appear in The Big Trail, so it's unclear which actor he replaced. The 12th and final film Carlos Villarías made in 1930 was El Código Penal, a remake of The Criminal Code, which had been shot from September to November 1930. Villarías was third billed behind Barry Norton and Maria Alba, but Villarías has the role of Mark Brady, played by Walter Huston in the original version, and is basically the star of the film. He plays a district attorney turned prison warden whose daughter falls in love with a young prisoner. Villarías received considerable acclaim for his performance. The Santa Monica Corsair newspaper said, Villarías gave a masterful characterization that was the dominating feature of the picture. Carlos Villarías continued his screen work in the first half of 1931, making 5 films in 6 months, 4 for Fox and 1 for Columbia. Del Infierno al Cielo, also known as Camino del Infierno, went into production in January at the Fox Studios. It was a remake of The Man Who Came Back, shot in 1930. The original version featured Janet Gaynor, Charles Farrell, and William Holden in the three leading roles. They were replaced in the Spanish version by Maria Alba, Juan Torrena, and Carlos Villarías. In February, Juan Torrena and Villarías were reunited in El Impostor, a remake of Fox's 1930 production Scotland Yard. Torrena took the Edmund Lowe role. The third-billed Carlos Villarías played Sir Arnoldo Bronson, which may have been the same character as Sir Clive Heathcote, a role originally taken by Lumsden Hare. Hay que casar el príncipe was the third teaming of singer Jose Mojica and Carlos Villarías, shot in April 1931. It was a remake of the 1927 romantic comedy Paid to Love, which had starred George O'Brien. Villarías was well down in the cast list, with most of the attention paid to Mojica, his romantic interest Conchita Montenegro, and Spanish comedian Miguel Ligero. Villarías had time in April 1931 for a second Fox film, Cuerpo y Alma. It was a remake of the recently released Body and Soul, which starred Charles Farrell and Elisa Landi in a tale of World War I aviators. The Spanish-language version was headlined by George J. Lewis. Carlos Villarías played a military officer, a role taken by Crawford Kent in the original. In May, Villarías and his Dracula co-star Barry Norton were reunited for El Pasado Acusa, this time working at Columbia Pictures. A remake of The Good Bad Girl, Villarías was cast as the villain and was quite visible in much of the film's publicity. Luana Alcañiz plays a young woman who breaks up with her gangster boyfriend, played by Villarías, and marries a decent man, but her ex-boyfriend doesn't want to give her up. The October 1931 issue of Cine Mundial said Carlos Villarías is notably outstanding in the protagonist role. Hombres en mi vida, shot from December 1931 until January 1932, was Columbia Pictures' final Spanish-language production. A remake of Men in Her Life, it starred Lupe Velez in the role originated by Lois Moran. The men in Hombres en mi vida included Gilbert Roland, Ramon Pereda, Paul Ellis, and Carlos Villarías. Villarías played a supporting role, and the Barcelona magazine Arte y Cinematografía said his acting was appropriate and discreet. The Spanish-language film sub-industry in Hollywood essentially collapsed in 1932. Other than Hombres en mi vida, which had begun production in 1931, only 4 feature films were made in Spanish in the USA in 1932, and 2 others in Paramount's Juanville studios outside Paris. Spanish-speaking actors saw their film work dry up. Carlos Villarías and a few others, thanks to their language skills, found work in English-language productions, although it was not until November 1932 that Villarías made his first English-language sound film. In 1933, Spanish-language filmmaking resumed in Hollywood, albeit at a reduced pace. Dos Noches, which began shooting in January 1933, was produced independently by Fanchan Royer, shot in just 5 days, and was an alternate version of Royer's Revenge at Monte Carlo. Jose Crespo starred in both versions. His leading ladies were June Collier and Conchita Montenegro. Carlos Villarías plays General Sanchez del Valle, a role apparently taken by Lloyd Ingram in the English version. Fox had continued to make Spanish-language features even in 1932, although significantly fewer than before, and Villarías worked on 3 films for the studio in 1933. He was also announced for a 4th, La Cruz y la Espada, but is not credited for appearing in this film. In No Dejes la Puerta Abierta, an alternate version of Pleasure Cruise, Carlos Villarías has a rather minor role of a ship's purser. The film was shot in June 1933, and Fox didn't call Villarías again until November, when he worked on La Ciudad de Cartón. A comedy about Hollywood, La Ciudad de Cartón was a rare original Spanish-language production, not based on a previous film. Carlos Villarías again has a relatively minor supporting role as a film director. Major roles went to performers he'd worked with before, including Antonio Moreno, Jose Crespo, and fellow opera singer turned actor Andrés de Segurola. De Segurola and Villarías were reunited in December for Granaderos del Amor, a relatively lavish period musical starring Raúl Rulién and Conchita Montenegro. A 2004 review of the film exists on IMDb, which suggests a print of this film survives, but does not seem to be readily available for screening. Villarías made 4 more Spanish-language features in Hollywood in 1934, 3 for Fox and 1 independent film. Dos más uno dos was shot in June. Rosita Moreno and Valentin Pereira starred in this remake of a 1927 Fox film, Don't Marry. This romantic comedy had some interesting opera connections. In addition to the presence of former opera singers Andrés de Segurola and Carlos Villarías, star Valentin Pereira was at the time married to American opera singer and actress Grace Moore. Señora Casada Necesita Marido altered the usual pattern. Based on a 1907 novel, it was not a remake of a previous English-language film, but was in fact remade by Fox in 1937 in English as The Lady Escapes. Carlos Villarías had a minor supporting role. The final Fox film of 1934 for Villarías was Asegure a su mujer. This was one of Fox Film's final Spanish-language productions prior to its merger with 20th Century Films to form 20th Century Fox. Raúl Rulién, Conchita Montenegro, and Antonio Moreno starred in this adaptation of an Argentine play. As in most of his later Fox films, Villarías had a supporting role. Carlos Villarías worked on Tres Amores, filmed in 7 days, beginning in July 1934 at the Talisman Studios in Hollywood on a budget of $18,000. The producers were Moe Sackin and Ken Goldsmith, who had previously produced an English-language version in 1932 under the title Bachelor Mother. Although Goldsmith and Sackin were technically independent producers, their projects were usually backed by and released through Universal Pictures. Gabriel Navarro's review of the film in La Opinión said Carlos Villarías has reconquered his former position in Spanish production. After shooting 2 films in California in the first 4 months of the year, Carlos Villarías departed for Mexico in May 1935. He would not make another movie in the USA until the summer of 1937. Fox had trimmed their contract roster of most of the actors working on Spanish-language features, and thus Villarías was not guaranteed the supporting roles he'd been performing in Fox films over the past several years. Before leaving the USA, Villarías had roles in El Diablo del Mar and Te Quiero con Locura. Beginning in February 1935, production began at the Mack Sennett Studios and on locations for El Diablo del Mar, otherwise known as The Sea Fiend. This was shot in 2 versions, English and Spanish. While Barry Norton appeared in both, the other major players were swapped out. Ramon Pereira, Movita Castañeda, and Carlos Villarías in the Spanish version, and Blanche Mahaffey, Jack Barty, and Jack Del Rio in the English version. The Sea Fiend received some theatrical release, but is best known today due to the 1946 re-release as Devil Monster. Te Quiero con Locura, filmed in April 1935, was the 17th and final Fox film for Carlos Villarías. This screwball comedy musical co-starred Raúl Julián and Rosita Moreno. Carlos Villarías' first visit to Mexico in 1935-37 resulted in 6 films to be discussed in a future episode. By 1937, the major studios in Hollywood had given up production of films in Spanish, although they would distribute such films made by independent producers. A dozen such pictures were produced in Hollywood between 1937 and 39, and Carlos Villarías appeared in 10 of them. Villarías worked on Tango Fe and Tea, which went into production at the Educational Studios in 1937. Rosita Moreno and her husband, former Paramount executive Melville Shower, formed Victoria Films to make the picture. Moreno fell ill and production ceased, resuming several years later. Because some of the original performers were no longer available, reshoots and the use of doubles were required, and it's unclear if the film, which was finally released in 1940, contains any Carlos Villarías footage. La Vida Bohemia, produced by Jaime del Amos Cantabria Films and released through Columbia Pictures, began shooting at the Hollywood studios in mid-August 1937. Rosita Diaz Jimeno, Gilbert Roland, Jose Crespo, Juan Torrena, and Miguel Ligero starred, with Carlos Villarías well down in the cast list. Cantabria Films made only one more feature, Verbena Trágica, which went before the cameras in May 1938. Carlos Villarías has a solid supporting role in this film, which stars Mexican actor Fernando Soler and Juan Torrena in his 11th of 12 screen collaborations with Villarías. Verbena Trágica was chosen for the National Film Registry in 1996 as a culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant film worthy of preservation. The next 2 films Villarías made in 1938 starred Tito Guizar. Like Jose Mojica, with whom Carlos Villarías had worked in the early 1930s, Guizar was a classically trained Mexican singer. He had shot to fame in the ranchera genre after starring in the 1936 Mexican movie Allá en el Rancho Grande. Rafael Ramos Cobian, who owned a chain of cinemas in Puerto Rico, spent a reported $75,000 to make Mis Dos Amores, shot at the General Service Studios beginning in June 1938. Paramount distributed the picture, in which Villarías plays the father of Blanca Castejón's character. She wants to marry medical student Tito Guizar, but Villarías prefers that she wed a wealthy man instead. El Trovador de la Radio was the next team-up of Guizar and Villarías. Shooting began in November 1938 at the Grand National Studios. The producer was Dario Faraya, and Paramount released this film as well. A review in La Opinión said, Villarías gives life to the short part he was assigned, as would be expected. Guizar's leading lady was Robina Duarte, whose real name was Ruby Kelly, and who later had a Hollywood acting career as Jean Brooks. Rafael Ramos Cobian hired Carlos Villarías for his next film, Los Hijos Mandan, which went before the cameras at the General Service Studios in December 1938. The filming of this period melodrama was apparently troubled. Shooting lasted until February 1939, the budget ballooned to $85,000, and distributor 20th Century Fox was reportedly unhappy with the results. Director Gabriel Soria and actors Fernando Soler, his brother Julián, and Arturo de Cordova were imported from Mexico. 1939 saw the end of Hollywood's Spanish-language experiment. Carlos Villarías appeared in 4 films this year. Two of these were Tito Guizar vehicles. Papá Soltero and El Otro Soy Yo were produced by Dario Faraya for Paramount Distribution and were shot in January and February at the Grand National Studios. Both films were directed by Richard Harlan and featured Guizar, Villarías, Amanda Varela, and Martín Garalaga. Papá Soltero was filmed in 9 days, and El Otro Soy Yo was done in just 8. El Milagro de la Calle Mayor, produced by Jack Skirball's Arcadia Pictures, was shot simultaneously in English and Spanish versions in April and May 1939. The English-language Miracle on Main Street starred Mexican-born actress Margot and Walter Abel, while the Spanish version kept Margot but replaced Abel with Arturo de Cordova. Carlos Villarías plays a doctor in the Spanish-language version only. Hollywood's last Spanish-language film of the era was La Inmaculada, which went into production on the 31st of May, 1939 at the Grand National Facility. The production company was Atalaya Films, headed by Maury M. Cohen and Fortunio Bonanova. Bonanova joined the ranks of Andrés de Segurola, Jose Mojica, and Tito Guizar as fellow opera singers who worked with Carlos Villarías. Bonanova imported Andrea Palma from Mexico to play the female lead. Palma and Villarías had worked together on the stage in Mexico during his first trip there in 1935 and had appeared together in the 1937 Mexican film Ave Sin Rumbo. La Inmaculada was released in the USA by United Artists and concluded Hollywood's decade-long experiment with Spanish-language cinema. Carlos Villarías worked one more time with producer Dario Faraya. In January 1940, it was announced that Faraya was supervising the dubbing into Spanish of the feature-length animated film Gulliver's Travels. Among the voice actors were Carlos Villarías, Martín Garalaga, singer Carlos Rufino, and his mother Mercedes Rufino. From 1929 to 1939, 120 Spanish-language feature films were made in Hollywood, compared to 18 shot in France, 5 in New York, and 2 in the United Kingdom. Of the 120 Hollywood-made films, Carlos Villarías appeared in 38, or 32%. Although credits information is not complete, it's possible Villarías was the most prolific performer in these films, followed by Jose Peña Pepet with at least 35 credits and Martín Garalaga at least 31 credits. How popular was Carlos Villarías among Spanish-speaking audiences? A February 1934 article in Cine Mundial magazine listed him 9th among male actors based on the amount of fan mail they received. The top actor was Jose Mojica, followed by Ramon Navarro, Raúl Rullien, Jose Crespo, Juan Torrena, Gilbert Roland, George Lewis, and Don Alvarado. Rounding out the top 10 were Villarías and Romualdo Tirado. Next episode, we'll look at the English-language films of Carlos Villarías. Stay tuned for more Night Train to Mondo Cine.